And only if you believe that is a source of strength could you believe they are superior to us. Otherwise, by everyone's reckoning, if you look at the range of strategic capabilities, we are stronger than they. That's a fact. Now, why, given all this, can't we do anything? To me, it's not that the record of arms control has been so bad. It's not that we have accomplished so little, but that we have taken so long to do it. 2 decades. In effect, to get each side to agree to do nothing more than they had done at the time they signed that agreement. What's going on? To be sure, there are problems of trust. It's inherent in the situation. Great powers, like individuals who just don't trust each other, and we in the Soviets don't trust each other, are not going to make big compromises. It's asking too much to make big compromises when there's no confidence there. It's also a fact that their forces are very different from ours. Their state of technological development is behind ours. And it's difficult when you have a situation like this, the apples and oranges, to make big trades that both sides are prepared to accept. How do you equate your concession against the other guys? It's too difficult to calibrate. But each time we have entered a negotiation with the Soviets, instead of taking these realities into account and planning the negotiations accordingly, we start off asking for the moon. It was Nixon's proposal that the Soviets virtually dismantle their land-based missile force at the start of SALT I that took 4 years to complete that negotiation. It was Jimmy Carter at the beginning of his administration wanting this comprehensive agreement instead of completing the work that Ford had done at Vladivostok, wanting to go beyond Vladivostok. That took us another 2.5 years to finish it. And here President Reagan is now talking about deep cuts in strategic forces. And up until 6 weeks ago, talking about eliminating all medium-range missiles in Europe. We know that's not going to happen. We know we wouldn't cut such a deal, and we know the Soviets wouldn't cut it. But you have demands from both the political left and the political right for real arms control. Let's do something that's militarily significant. Let's freeze things. Let's eliminate all these systems. And it's simply not going to happen. There isn't the trust, there isn't the symmetry of capability, and there isn't the support in either place for making big compromises. We could go much further, much faster, in dealing with the threat of nuclear war if we recognized this overwhelming reality and took smaller steps, took them faster to get where we need to go sooner. Because as matters now stand, we've been negotiating for 2 decades and we have only one ratified treaty doing it this other way. Well, we started out asking for a lot because of what both conservatives and liberals were demanding, and then gradually pulled back, till you got something you could deal on. Only one ratified. We haven't had a single arms control treaty with the Soviet Union ratified since 1972. Because people's notions of what you can accomplish by this have well outstripped reality. And that will continue to happen until people show the political leadership that they understand. And understanding means demythologizing those arguments, what damage arms control has supposedly done us. Making progress means depoliticizing this enterprise to some degree so that politicians are not rewarded for saying ridiculous things. When you do the small steps I'm suggesting, I'm not arguing that you're going to end up solving the problems inherent in the political differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. We're not going to be able to solve those problems with arms control treaties. But without them, there are no solutions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gelb has agreed to entertain questions for a few moments.
We don't need to restrict ourselves to this subject and go on to some other things if you'd like.
Well, SALT II, where do you see Reagan having a problem with it? Why wasn't it, what do you see, why wasn't it ratified?
Well, I tell you, I haven't...
You like it also, I should say. Did you like the final version of SALT II?
I thought it was the best we could do at that point. I would like to have done other things, but there's tomorrow. You fix what you can now, and you go on to tackle other problems later. I wish the Soviets would have made 100 more concessions to us, but they weren't going to do it. We put a lid on the competition. The treaty was to last for 8 years. We were to start negotiating on another treaty as soon as that one was signed. We would have dealt with some of the other problem next time. I found very few people in the Reagan administration who have read the SALT II treaty. And I've had conversations with an awful lot of them. Most of them haven't got the foggiest idea what's in there. Before I left the administration, I went around the country to different groups to talk about the agreement. And there had been people there before me talking about it, opponents, who had said certain things were in the treaty that were not in the treaty, and had said certain things were not in the treaty that were in the treaty. Now here I am in front of a group, and it's a kind of subject, people think very technical. They're not going to understand it. As soon as you get into any of the details, the eyes start to glaze over. And it takes a minute to lay down an accusation and an hour to clear it up. And a number of these people who were going around making the charges, I knew better. They had read the document. They were against the treaty for broader reasons. They just thought arms control was not the thing to have at this critical testing moment in Soviet-American relations. Now we had to begin alerting American people to the imminent Soviet danger. And you couldn't do that and at the same time argue for arms control. And they were very cynical in attacking SALT to achieve this larger purpose. But it's very difficult when people won't take the little time out necessary to understand to deal with that kind of problem. I would come in behind some retired military officer, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, and people would walk out, and I could see it on their faces. They would say, well, this fellow Gelb, he seems like a straightforward, honest guy, but the other guy seemed like a straightforward, honest guy to me too. So I don't know who to believe. And at best, you end up with a wash. And I even used to bring the text of this thing along to point to it. Because I found that if I could really catch them black and white in something, that would affect people's perceptions. But if those who had been there before me had been more clever, it was hard for me to point to a specific passage and say, look, they're just not telling you the truth. In the case of Ronald Reagan, I would bet you dollars to donuts he still hasn't read it. And in the case, every conversation I've had with Caspar Weinberg, he shows no evidence of knowing what's in that agreement. A number of other people at middle levels have read it. They have their differences, to which my response has been, well, go negotiate some revisions, and let's seal it up and go on.
What kind of small steps would you advocate that would build confidence toward eliminating nuclear weapons?
Well, the main problem to get at is the hardest one to get at, namely the growing capability on both sides to believe that they can control a nuclear war. They can fight a precision conflict. They could hit certain targets, not others. They could limit population deaths. They could fire off a few salvos, hold back, and see what the results were. That they could conduct this more or less as an artillery duel. Now, both sides are developing weapons with the kind of accuracy and command and control capabilities with the kind of reach, instantaneous reach, to give leaders on both sides the illusion that they might actually be able to control this. That, to me, is the single most dangerous thing that could happen. Because if you think you can manage these things, you don't treat them with enough respect. I don't want any human being, lacking in wisdom as we are, to have that kind of belief about nuclear weapons. I don't want it. It's too dangerous. How do you get at it? You hit it frontally, you run up against all the problems I talked about. I want to build some momentum in this process. I would start, with something very small indeed, dealing with medium-range missiles in Europe, just to break that deadlock, do very little on our side, ask very little of them, so that we can then throw all medium and strategic weapons into one pot, where it's easier to make compromises. Throw them all into one pot, there's more to deal with. It's easier to make reductions. At the same time, I would accept the reality that we're not going to get the Soviets to eliminate the one thing they're better than us in, land-based missiles, while we retain all our advantages in the other weapons. And I would be prepared over a long time, over a period of 10 years, to have them phase down some of their land-based weapons as we agree to curtail numbers of our weapons in other areas. But they're not going to do it over the short run, nor are we. I was in the Soviet Union in March, and one of the people I spoke to was Marshal Ogarkov, who was the chairman of the Soviet Armed Forces, equivalent of our chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he said to me then, as he had 2 years before, that he would be prepared over time to phase out the land-based missiles, phase them down, but it would have to take a very long time, because the quicker they phase these down, the more our advantages in these other areas would count against them. Now, even though I could argue with him about that, he's not going to change that view. And I would grind that into the step-by-step process. I could foresee, if we lowered our sights for each step, 3 or 4 agreements over the next 8 years, putting us at the position for the first time of being able to get at this central core problem, the illusion that one can fight and survive and win nuclear wars. I've spelled this out in some greater detail in an article I wrote that's on the cover of the New York Magazine about 3 weeks ago. And for those of you who may be passionate on the subject, we could talk about it later. Yes.
Do you believe that nuclear war is an eventuality, and if it was, do you honestly believe it would be limited?
I tell you, it's very hard for me to believe that unless we take a lot of steps and make a lot of progress in this area, that we can avoid some outbreak of nuclear war. And that once it occurs, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to control. Because the devastation on both sides is so enormous that it will be difficult to hold back those who want to fire off more weapons. Just the dynamics of the situation, I think we should never assume are manageable. You know, I only talked about Soviet-American nuclear competition. There are other countries that will in time develop nuclear capabilities, unless we give them good reason not to. And while I don't think we and the Soviets have any particular monopoly on wisdom, or the French and British or the Chinese, the fact is that the more societies one has where one could have unstable leaders does increase this risk. And these problems must be dealt with some celerity. Otherwise, none of the rest of it is going to matter. Even if you say the chances are less than 1%, it's too high given the consequences. Yes.
You think in these arms limitation talks, is it the real purpose or intention of each country to have a good, fair limitation of the arms between the two countries? Or does each country go into the talks trying to come out with an edge over the other country? And not just the Soviet Union, but us too.
Sure, you always try for an edge. And the bigger the edge you try for, the longer it takes for the negotiations to consummate. Because, in my judgment, the Soviet Union and the United States are in a position of rough parity. And neither has to make major concessions to the other. And either will wait, both will wait there long enough to come out with an agreement that it considers equitable. You will find that if Ronald Reagan gets a START treaty, that he will have abandoned almost all of his major positions. Otherwise, not going to get it. And, it only stands to reason. One could look at the president and say, Mr. President, why do you think the Soviets would give you what you're asking? When you're asking them, in effect, to tear down the one area where they're better than we are and we hold on to everything else, when you yourself are saying they're stronger than we are. Why should they cut such a deal? Why shouldn't they negotiate from strength? So if there is to be a deal, it's going to be much more modest than where both sides are right now. Yes, sir.
I seem to be a little skeptical, maybe I misunderstood, regarding the nuclear freeze movement. What is your position on it?
I'm against it because I think it would take longer to negotiate, far longer to negotiate, than the kind of steps I'm talking about. First of all, to negotiate a ban on production of nuclear weapons would in itself be a breathtaking enterprise, because we would have to be in a position of being able to enter almost every major facility in the Soviet Union and to let them do the same here. And to work out the details of that, forget everything else, would be a 5-year enterprise or longer, maybe never achievable at all. Point one. Point two, you'd have to spend a great deal of time agreeing exactly as to what would be included and what would be excluded. Would it be just strategic weaponry? Would it be everything else? Would it be a freeze for 6 months or a year? Once it's for a year, let's say, it might be difficult for us to say we want to resume politically, but pretty easy at any point the Soviets might want to say, for them to just start deploying again. In a democracy, it would be hard to overturn something like that. In a dictatorship, not. We already had that experience with the Soviets 1960s when there was a moratorium on nuclear testing in the atmosphere, which they woke up one day and broke. We couldn't do that. They could. If the freeze is to last over several years, how do we maintain our production lines, design teams? Is Congress going to foot all that money for them to sit around and literally do nothing? The Soviet Union, that's no problem. There are a host of other difficulties, practical issues. But the nub of it to me is that it seems simple to say freeze, but go negotiate it and you have a very complicated, time-consuming process on your hands, one that falls victim to the very problems that I've been trying to outline, and one that stands in the way of taking those small steps that'll get us to our ultimate goal far sooner. I would take on that freeze debate with anyone, and I'm an arms control advocate. All the way in the back.
We talked a lot about nuclear arms in this country, obviously because I suppose of their destructive capabilities, but the Europeans have been focusing much more on conventional forces recently, I suppose, because they think that they're buying time playing games with nuclear weapons. They obviously know what it's like to go through a war. We don't. And I have heard many leaders in Western European countries expressing the opinion that we should worry more about conventional forces than we should nuclear forces. I was wondering what your feelings are.
Well, I wish that were true, but it isn't. In fact, the French and the British are spending increasing percentages of their military budgets on nuclear weapons. And both countries are about to go into full-scale modernization programs. Right now, between them, the French and British have about 300 missile warheads, medium-range missile warheads. By the end of this decade, that will be around 1,500. The British are going to buy from us the new Trident submarine missile, and the French are going to deploy a whole new generation of submarine-launched missiles themselves. And these expenditures are very, very costly and are going to cause both countries to cut back on conventional force expenditures. Go ahead.
Do you think that's one reason then why they're not very receptive to bringing in their nuclear forces into any agreement?
Absolutely, it's one of the main reasons. You see, here's a typical problem. Let me just take a moment out to illustrate exactly what I'm driving at. We have the talks between the Soviet Union and the United States on medium-range forces in Europe. The Russians say they should cover missiles and aircraft. We say just missiles, because we say that that's the real problem. Those are the dangerous weapons. And besides, we can't agree on what aircraft should be included and not included. The Russians present a list of some 2,000 American aircraft that they say should be included. We present a list of 200 American aircraft. And I tell you, having participated in SALT negotiations in 1969 and then in the Carter administration, we can sit there till doomsday with them, arguing about which aircraft to include and not include. The second issue. The Russians say that our totals should include French and British forces. They say, hey, Gromyko says, hey, when the missile comes over Soviet territory, does it say on it, I am a British missile? I am a French missile? What do we care? It's coming from your side. They're not going to shoot it at you. And we say, you know, I can understand you saying that, but the fact is we don't control their forces, and we don't. So why should we count in our totals forces that we don't control? And they say, I don't care whether you control them, they're going to hit us. They're your friends, not ours. And besides, we're not going to touch our forces in Asia because the Chinese have nuclear weapons there aimed at us, and you're putting new battleships out into that area armed with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. And you want us to have just one pot of medium-range missiles and forget about your forces and Chinese forces in Asia? Now, a Solomon with a mandate from heaven could not resolve those things in one package. How do you do it? The solution I offered was to try to skip some of these problems now, because you're not going to work out the compromises on them. You're just not. They're fundamental. I would say to the Soviets, look, You don't have to touch your best medium-range weapons at all, your SS-20s. You can't deploy any new ones, but you don't have to destroy any older ones. You only destroy your older medium-range missiles, the SS-4s and 5s. We, in turn, would only deploy our ground-launched cruise missiles and not the Pershing ballistic missiles. Pershing ballistic missiles can reach Soviet territory in near the Soviet capital in about 12 minutes. Cuts down on their warning time. Cruise missiles fly at the pace of an aircraft, so it gives them more warning time. So we don't deploy any ballistic missiles on our side. You have them on your side. You don't have to make any big reductions in your SS-20s, and that's the compensation in effect, de facto, for the French and British forces. So you get around the compromise because you can't make it at this point. Then in the second stage, I would take all those medium-range forces and combine them in one negotiation with the strategic forces, where when you're not dealing with a few hundred warheads, but you're dealing with 10,000, you have more room for compromise and maneuver. It's that kind of approach and mentality that I hope to see injected into the debate. Otherwise, you get nowhere. You just sit there and look at each other. Go ahead.
You characterize arms negotiations as being difficult and taking much longer than they would ordinarily presumably take because people are asking too much on either side. People are asking for an advantage. And I've always thought that arms negotiations were basically show and tell for the folks at home, see we're out there trying to do something. And I thought I might come here tonight and find out what kind of an agenda there really was behind such criminal activities as the complete destruction of the Northern Hemisphere, at least, with even a tenth of the arsenal on both sides. Could you tell me why, at least you can't speak for the other side, could you tell me why our side will continue to go on building so much?
Well, first of all, it's a fact that when these negotiations start, we end up asking for the kinds of things that people on both the left and the right think should be included. Yes, indeed. And we end up simply legitimizing the arms race. You start off with something terribly ambitious, you end up accepting the status quo. Now, why do we do it? I'm an old movie buff. I like to stay up late at night and watch the movies from 2 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock. And I read TV Guide to get the descriptions of these things. And one night, as I was thumbing through it, I came across a movie with a fascinating title. It was called Night of the Lepus. So I looked up, see what the movie was about, and it says, Night of the Lepus. Giant rabbit terrorizes Arizona. And I said to myself, hey, that's what's going on in my business. You have, as an arms control advocate, so much as it is these political extremes driving our leaders to do things that just aren't very sensible. Now, do arms manufacturers want to manufacture their arms? Yes, to be sure. Is it difficult to control technology? Yes. But you could tackle every one of these issues if we approached these negotiations with more realism. I'll tell you something about the Soviets. The Soviets, while they are far more unreasonable than we are far more realistic than we are too. You can have a conversation with a Soviet. I went over there for 2 weeks this last time, and it's an experience because they never agree with you. They just don't. The best you'll get out of some of them is they'll pass on to the next subject. And it comes time to make a compromise, they will make the compromise. They set their sights much lower because they know right off they're not prepared to make a big move. And in fact, I think the way they've approached arms control is far more realistic and responsible than the way we have. I wish they would be more forthcoming, I wish we would. But they won't be, nor will we. And the reason isn't the military-industrial conspiracy, it is primarily that our political debate is our own worst enemy. And we continue to reward our politicians for being the giant rabbit. Yes, sir.
You've mentioned that you have some real fear of nuclear war in the future, 1% or less. You mentioned that the only agreement that we've had recently basically was an agreement that we will do just what we've already done, in other words, really didn't break any new ground. What real objective do you think there is in the negotiation that could be accomplished, or what benefits could be accomplished, or none at all? Reason is there, in fact, to have limitations, especially in light of the new technologies, which in a certain sense would outdate any agreement?
I don't think that the initial agreements would solve the most important problems. But I also know that no agreements aren't going to solve the problems either. And I think that if we begin to corral this competition in the ways I've suggested and bite into it where we can, that you get to the point somewhere over the next decade of being able to tackle the harder problems and of leadership on both sides being willing to make those compromises, because they will have built up over that time some greater confidence in the reliability of the agreement, some greater sense that we can manage the relationship with each other even with these agreements. And over the course of the decade, a sense that our forces are more comparable, that we're not attempting to realign them to unilateral advantage. But it can't be done quickly. It's an enterprise for a decade or more if we do it right. It's an enterprise that will never get started on at all if we continue doing it the way we have been.
Let me follow up on that. I'm sure you're familiar with the sort of balance of power notion about whether once that has a balance, it's more secure than the other, or if they're both equal. Do you think that if the nuclear situation were such that each side had half the weapons that they do today, it would be more secure than if they both had twice? Perhaps the leaders are equally afraid of the complexities and the glazed eye effect, and the fact that everybody's afraid to push a single button because it would unleash, 10,000 things. Don't you think you'd be more afraid if it would unleash maybe 100 or 1,000 missiles than if it would unleash 10,000?
Well, it's not necessarily true that the fewer weapons you have, the safer we'll all be. It's not necessarily true that if there are deep reductions, that you've actually reduced the risks of war. Let me give you an example, because this is another point where I feel both the left and the right have managed to substantially distort the debate. When you're thinking about planning nuclear wars, or the feasibility of it, the critical variable is the ratio of warheads to targets, bullets to things you're going to shoot at. And if you feel you've got enough bullets so that you can use only a few of them and destroy all the targets and still have bullets left and the other guy hasn't got many at all, then you're in a situation that's inherently unstable. And if you take the Reagan proposal for deep cuts in strategic forces, where he wants to cut both sides' missile warheads. Follow me, you can't understand this. He's proposing to cut the number of missile warheads on both sides from about 7,500 to 5,000. A third. Big cut. When you work out the mathematics of it, the fact is that he would have increased the ratio of warheads to targets rather than decreased it, and made the situation even more unstable. So reductions in numbers of weapons and warheads per se doesn't make it safer. The key things are the kinds of weapons involved, the systems for controlling them, the new development, the development of new weapons underway. These are things that will really cut into the kind of problem I think could cause war, the feeling that you could control and manage it, even win it. Reductions per se sound good, but in the end, they really don't add much to stability and don't make life much safer for us. Yes, we should do them. They ought to be part of an arms control package, but you ought not to delude yourself that you've made any of us safer in the enterprise. In fact, by focusing all the political energy on reducing numbers of missile warheads, you may be putting it in the wrong place. Yes.
What do you think should be done about continuing Soviet Union and U.S. funding of conflicts in the Middle East and Central America?
Funding of what?
Of conflicts, funding of guerrilla groups and military advisors, etc.
Well, big question. What's going on in Central America makes me very glad I'm not in government. Don't have to face those kinds of choices. We're very lucky as Americans in the life we lead and the freedom we have. And we've been so rewarded by our history and by our geography that we know less of the world than maybe any other country in the world. We're less concerned with them. We need them less. And when it comes to the issue of change, it frightens Americans. It really does. In our roots, because we do have something so special here, so important, so good, that when change occurs anywhere, it seems to threaten our vitals. It makes Americans very nervous. The feeling that somehow this can set off a chain reaction that would somehow tumble to our own borders at some point. And we believed that in Vietnam. Americans supported the war in Vietnam until quite late, even though it was 10,000 miles away. And they're much more frightened underneath it all by something happening on the borders, by change. And even though I think most would probably agree that you're going to get social change in an area like Central America, whatever the Soviet Union does or whatever Cuba does, that it's primarily because of internal causes, history. The feeling still is that somehow it could affect us, change us. And most Americans are willing to try to do something to prevent that. They're not quite clear why. They're willing to do something. Certainly not necessarily send American troops. Second thing is, it's hard to know who to help and who is right and who's wrong there. I know nothing about Central America. The last 2 years, I've no independent basis of judgment in the way I would in a number of other areas. And I've spent the last 2 years talking to people about Central America because it is so important, trying to know. And yesterday I had a conversation with a nun who has been working in the town of Jalapa in Nicaragua. It's right near the Honduran border. Her name is Lisa Fitzgerald. Comes from a good conservative Irish Catholic family, became a nun, gets shipped down to Nicaragua. spends the day going out in the fields at 5:30 in the morning and working till 3 and coming back and doing hospital work after that. And I said to her, you know, tell me whether the leaders of the Nicaraguan Revolution, in your opinion, really are prepared to abandon their dictatorship because they are mostly interested in doing right for their people, and they don't want to spread revolution throughout Central America. They want to take care of their own problems at home. Tell me that if you believe it. Tell me whether you think we're telling the truth, the administration, that the government down there is simply a dictatorship in Nicaragua and that their main aim is to spread revolution in Central America. She says, I'm not going to be able to help you with your problem. She's down there, for 2 years, living inside this problem. And her answer to it was not, this side is telling the truth and that one is lying. It was that we don't know them, they don't know us, we ought to leave them alone. And her instinct in this, I must say, was like my own instinct. If I don't know something, I don't try to reshape it. I respect my lack of knowledge. And in the case of Central America, I would, as hard as this is to say, I would essentially go with the flow down there. I think that we can live with social change, and I think in the end, if we do, these people will look far more to us than to anyone else. They need us, and in the end, we're far better for them than any Soviet model or Cuban model.